The rain that night did not fall. It whispered. It threaded down the glass walls of the 52nd floor like silver veins, tracing the reflections of 3 men who stood around a single, gleaming contract. Outside, San Francisco shimmered with its skyline of ambition, the Bay Bridge glowing faintly in the fog. Inside, the air smelled of espresso, new leather, and the kind of hope that makes men gamble everything they have. Daniel Tran watched the 2 younger men across the table, Ethan Blake and Mark Connors. They were the kind of people who filled rooms. Ethan with his sharp eyes and faster tongue. Mark with the confidence of someone who'd never failed badly enough to understand fear. Daniel liked them instantly. They reminded him of himself 15 years earlier. Bold, untested, a little too sure that the world would eventually kneel before their ideas. "I'll be honest," Daniel said, adjusting his cufflinks as his voice cut through the soft hum of the air conditioning. "You boys are asking for a lot of money. More than most people in this town would risk on 2 guys with a PowerPoint deck and a dream." Ethan leaned forward, elbows on the table, fire behind his grin. "It's not a dream, Mr. Tran. It's a framework. We've already built a prototype for distributed data compression. Hypernova isn't just cloud software. It's the next step in data autonomy." Mark added, quieter but more precise, "Imagine corporations owning their own private data galaxies, self-sustaining, self-correcting. We're talking billions in infrastructure saved." Daniel studied them for a long moment, his reflection warped in the contract's glossy paper. He'd heard 1,000 pitches like this. Most were noise, but there was something in Ethan's voice, the reckless certainty of someone who'd already seen the future and was willing to die getting there. He smiled. "Then let's make a galaxy." When he signed, the pen made a sound that felt louder than thunder. The next few years blurred into light and velocity. Hypernova technologies grew like wildfire. Their office moved from a cramped co-working space near Market Street to a panoramic suite overlooking the city. Venture capitalists circled like vultures, hungry and polite. Journalists called it the future of intelligent storage. Daniel called it his second life. He'd made his fortune years ago, sold a logistics startup at the height of the dot-com boom, bought real estate, traveled the world. But Hypernova was different. This was personal. For the first time in decades, he felt the pulse of innovation in his veins again. Ethan would bring wild, almost chaotic ideas. Mark would distill them into diagrams, code, execution. Daniel brought experience, the steady hand that turned spark into structure. They were unstoppable, or so it seemed. Ethan had a saying he loved to repeat in meetings. "If it's not insane, it's not innovation." It made investors nervous and employees proud. He was brilliant, dangerously so. He slept 4 hours a night, lived on coffee and adrenaline, and treated deadlines like dares from God. Mark, meanwhile, was the quiet current beneath the noise, pragmatic, strategic, always thinking 5 steps ahead. Daniel trusted them like family. He didn't just sign checks, he mentored them, took them to dinner, introduced them to people who mattered. There were nights, champagne-soaked, laughter-heavy nights, when the 3 of them would stand on the balcony, looking down at the city lights and talking about changing the world. "You built the foundation," Ethan said once, drunk on both whiskey and victory. "We'll build the cathedral." Daniel laughed. "Then don't forget who poured the concrete." It was a joke, back then. But success changes texture over time. At first, the pressure came from outside, competitors, market demands, endless scaling. Then, it started to come from within. Hypernova's board expanded. Investors demanded growth curves steeper than sanity. Ethan began skipping Daniel's calls, then his meetings. Mark's tone shifted, polite, but with edges. Daniel didn't notice the pattern forming. He only felt the distance. When he finally did, it was too late. The proposal was presented one spring afternoon, polished, wrapped in language so neutral it felt harmless. Operational realignment, board efficiency, equity reallocation. They said it was temporary, that it would streamline decision-making, while Daniel took a strategic advisory role. He didn't see the knife behind the words. Within a week, his voting rights were suspended, his shares diluted, his name quietly removed from Hypernova's internal registry. When he confronted Ethan, the younger man looked at him, calm, distant, almost pitying. "It's not personal, Daniel," he said, voice like glass. "You built us, but you're not the future anymore." Daniel's silence filled the office like a slow leak. He remembered their first meeting, the rain on the window, the spark in Ethan's eyes, the word galaxy. He left the building that day without a sound. Security escorted him out, polite but firm. The automatic doors closed behind him, sealing away a lifetime of trust in the hiss of compressed air. For a while he tried to rebuild, quietly, cautiously. He invested in smaller startups, mentored young founders, wrote essays no one read. But something inside him had cracked. It wasn't the loss of money. He'd lost that before. It was the betrayal, intimate, deliberate, efficient. The kind of wound only family can inflict. Years passed. San Francisco changed, then changed again. The city became younger, faster, louder. Daniel grew older, quieter, invisible. Then one day, driving along the Pacific Coast Highway in a rented car, he picked up a passenger. A tired young woman, startup badge still hanging from her neck. She spent the ride venting about her CEO stealing her work. Daniel listened in silence. When she got out, she thanked him for not interrupting. That night, he applied to drive for Uber. He told himself it was temporary, a distraction, but it became something else, a way to observe the city from its bloodstream, to see the powerful in unguarded moments, the arrogant unmasked by routine. He became a ghost behind the wheel, listening, learning, watching. Every ride a confession booth with tinted windows. And then, 7 years after the night of his exile, he received a ride request. Pickup, Ethan Blake. Drop-off, Hypernova Technologies headquarters. For a long time, he stared at the screen, the name glowing faintly against the dark. He accepted. The morning of the ride, Los Angeles wore its usual disguise. Golden, careless, unrepentant. Daniel shaved, ironed his shirt, and polished the Tesla until it reflected the sun like a blade. As he slid behind the wheel, he caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. Older, calmer, but with the same eyes that once believed in galaxies. He wondered briefly what Ethan would look like now, whether he'd recognize the man he'd buried under layers of humility and silence, whether he'd even care. When the door opened and Ethan stepped in, followed by Mark, the years folded in on themselves like paper. They hadn't changed much. Success had just added polish to their arrogance. They didn't even glance at him beyond a mechanical smile. "Afternoon," Ethan said. "To Hypernova, please." Daniel only nodded, voice steady. "Of course." The Tesla pulled away from the curb, merging into the flow of traffic. As the city blurred past, Daniel listened. Their voices filled the cabin, easy, confident, unaware. They spoke of numbers, acquisitions, a coming deal that would end the old man's control, once and for all. They laughed about contracts, loopholes, the way trust makes fools of men. And Daniel, the silent driver, smiled once. Small, invisible. Every empire forgets the hand that built it. The sun tilted westward, spilling gold across the freeway. The car hummed softly beneath them, a quiet storm gathering behind the wheel. Somewhere between the laughter and the hum of the tires, the line between past and present vanished, and what began as a simple ride became something else entirely. The air thickened. The lights of the city stretched ahead like destiny. And as the Tesla turned toward the glass towers of Hypernova Technologies, the ghosts of 7 years rode along, silent, watching, waiting. The hum of the Tesla faded into the silence of Daniel's memory, and what replaced it was the echo of that boardroom 7 years ago. The sterile chill of corporate air conditioning, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights, the sound of men in suits slicing futures apart with pens instead of knives. He remembered standing there while Ethan talked. The young man had perfected the art of betrayal disguised as logic. Words like optimization and transition strategy poured from his mouth, each syllable polished with politeness, each sentence laced with poison. Mark, sitting beside him, didn't meet Daniel's eyes. His fingers drummed a soft rhythm against the mahogany table, a nervous tell that Daniel had once found endearing during late-night brainstorming sessions. Now it felt like the heartbeat of a traitor. Daniel's name was being erased in real time. His voice, his votes, his influence, all stripped away under the guise of corporate evolution. He watched Ethan gesture to the presentation on the wall, graphs and projections dancing like ghosts in the blue glow of the screen. The young CO-to-be looked almost proud. "This isn't personal," Ethan said then, voice measured, almost gentle. "It's just necessary. Hypernova needs agility, Daniel. We can't move fast enough with so many layers of oversight." "Layers," Daniel repeated, his voice dry as ash. "You mean me?" Ethan didn't answer. Mark cleared his throat, murmured something about shareholder expectations. The lawyers nodded on cue. The HR director pretended to check her tablet, and the silence between them stretched like a chasm. That was the moment Daniel realized the truth. He was already gone. They weren't asking him to step aside. They were informing him he already had. He should have fought harder. He should have shouted, torn the documents in half, reminded them who had built this empire from an idea and a handshake. But betrayal has a way of paralyzing the body before it reaches the voice. So he stood there, frozen, while they dismantled his legacy. The world outside was still drenched in fog when Daniel stepped out of the building for the last time. The Hypernova logo glowed above him like an accusation, cutting through the gray morning mist. He held his badge for a long moment before dropping it into the gutter. It landed face up, his photo staring back at him with the same quiet confidence he used to feel. The rain carried it away. That night, he drove aimlessly through the city until dawn. He ended up at the marina, where the fog met the water in soft gray waves. He watched the boats drift. For the first time in his life, he had nowhere to be. Money wasn't the problem. He still had enough investments, enough savings to live comfortably. But wealth was hollow without purpose. Power meant nothing when no one called your name in the hallways anymore. In the weeks that followed, the calls came. Reporters, investors, a few concerned friends asking how he was handling the transition. Daniel said little. The business world moved on. Articles framed his departure as a graceful exit of a visionary investor making room for youth and innovation. The headlines were polite lies. When he saw Ethan and Mark appear on CNBC, smiling beside the new board, he didn't watch the full segment. He turned off the television, sat in the dark, and poured himself a glass of scotch. He didn't hate them then. Not yet. He only felt hollow. Months passed. He traveled. Paris, Kyoto, Singapore. He met people who called him sir and mentor, who asked for advice on startups, leadership, investment. He told them all the same thing. Never trust a man who calls you family in business. But even then, he said it without bitterness. Just truth. When he returned to California, he found himself restless. His days felt borrowed, his nights too quiet. One afternoon, sitting in a cafe in Santa Monica, he overheard two young tech founders arguing about a pitch deck. Their energy, their blind optimism, it pulled something awake inside him. He missed that world, the chaos, the stakes, the creation, and yet he couldn't go back. His name was a ghost now, a relic whispered about in conference rooms but never written on the walls again. So he began to observe instead, to watch the city from the periphery. He sat in hotel lobbies, airport terminals, cafes in Palo Alto. He listened to conversations about funding rounds and failed prototypes, mergers and acquisitions, backstabbing and ambition. He started recognizing faces, names, patterns. The more he listened, the more he realized something fundamental. The game hadn't changed. Only the players had. And the game always rewards those who know how to wait. It was a December evening when the idea came to him, not as vengeance but as curiosity. He was in a rideshare, sitting in the back seat of a stranger's Toyota, listening to the driver talk about his side hustle, about the strange intimacy of being invisible to people. "People don't look at me," the driver said. They talk like I'm not even there. But I hear everything. Affairs, deals, lies, promises. Sometimes I think I know this city better than anyone else. Daniel looked at him, studying his reflection in the mirror. The man's words lingered. That night, Daniel signed up to drive for Uber. First, it was absurd. The profile photo, the background check, the hours behind the wheel, it all felt like theater. A millionaire in disguise. But he told himself it was research and experiment. Then it became something else. The streets of Los Angeles became his new office. The car, his new boardroom. He met every kind of person. Actors between auditions, executives sneaking calls, couples arguing, kids crying, founders scheming. Each ride was a story, a confession. Each passenger forgot him the moment they stepped out. He learned how to listen again, how to disappear. Sometimes, he'd drive past Hypernova's new satellite office in Culver City. He'd see the logo on the glass doors and feel nothing, or so he told himself. Then, one Friday afternoon, his phone buzzed with a new ride request. Pickup, Ethan Blake. Destination, Hypernova Technologies headquarters. For a long while, he just stared at the name. The letters seemed to pulse against the screen, like a heartbeat he thought he'd buried years ago. He could have declined, should have, but his finger moved before he thought. Accept ride. The map guided him through the wide boulevards of Beverly Hills, past manicured hedges and the sterile calm of money. When he stopped at the curb, the door opened, and Ethan stepped in, older, sharper, still immaculate in his tailored suit. His cologne filled the car instantly, the same scent Daniel remembered from those late nights at the office when they'd celebrated their first funding round. Afternoon, Ethan said absently, eyes on his phone. To Hypernova, please. Daniel's voice was even. Of course. The door closed. A moment later, another opened. Mark Connors climbed in, heavier now, his once bright hair graying at the temples. They didn't look at him, didn't recognize him. Not yet. The Tesla slid into the sunlit traffic. They began talking almost immediately, their words spilling freely as though the driver were invisible, because to them he was. Mark sighed. This new partnership deal's going to be tricky. The old man's paranoid. Ethan chuckled. Please. He's desperate. He thinks this merger will save his ass. The board already wants him out. Once he signs the false contract, we'll take control of the IP, move the assets offshore, and let him drown in his own mess. Mark laughed, the kind of laughter that fills silence with arrogance. You're ruthless. It's not ruthlessness, Ethan said, still scrolling through his phone. It's business. He's had his time. Now it's ours. Daniel said nothing. He adjusted the mirror slightly, just enough to catch Ethan's reflection. The same confident smirk, the same hunger. The years hadn't changed him. Outside, the palm trees flickered past in rhythmic blurs. Inside, their voices carried on, dissecting strategies, mocking rivals, bragging about the millions at stake. Sometimes, Ethan said, I think we could tell the driver everything and he'd still have no clue what we're talking about. Mark laughed again. Yeah, that's the beauty of being invisible. Huh? Daniel's eyes flicked toward the mirror for a second. Just long enough. The car turned onto the freeway, sunlight slicing across the dashboard like a blade. The hum of the tires drowned out their laughter, replaced by the low, steady rhythm of inevitability. He'd thought he was done with revenge, thought he'd outgrown anger. But there, in the claustrophobic quiet of that car, listening to the two men who'd once called him mentor plot to betray someone else, Daniel felt something awaken. Not rage, not hate, something colder, purpose. When they finally arrived at the glass tower that bore the Hypernova logo, Ethan checked his watch and muttered, We're late. Mark said, Doesn't matter. They can wait for us. Daniel pulled up to the curb. The car stopped. For a moment, neither of them moved. Thanks, man, Ethan said, tossing a casual glance toward him without recognition. Keep the change. He reached for the door handle, and Daniel spoke. His voice was calm even, but it carried weight. Mr. Blake. Ethan froze. The sound of his name, spoken in a tone he hadn't heard in years, hung in the air like static. He turned slowly. Daniel met his eyes in the rearview mirror. "You forgot to take your briefcase." The younger man blinked, confused. Then Daniel smiled. Not wide, not cruel, just enough to unsettle. "Or maybe you left it behind before," Daniel said softly. "About 7 years ago." Recognition hit like thunder. Ethan's face drained of color. Mark's eyes widened. Before either of them could speak, Daniel stepped out of the car, opening the trunk. The reflection of the Hypernova Tower gleamed on the Tesla's metallic surface, fractured and perfect. He lifted a black leather briefcase, sleek, identical to the one Ethan carried now. Mark whispered, "What the hell?" Daniel turned to them, his voice calm. "I believe we have a meeting." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Ethan tried to recover, straightening his jacket, forcing a laugh. "Daniel, wow. This is unexpected." "Unexpected," Daniel repeated. "That's one word for it." He walked toward them, each step measured, controlled. "You're still playing the same game, Ethan. Still mistaking cleverness for intelligence." Mark took a step back. "What do you want?" Daniel smiled faintly. "You'll find out soon enough." The sun caught the chrome edges of the briefcase as he set it down on the hood of the car. Inside, neatly stacked, were contracts. Not for revenge. For revelation. Because Daniel hadn't come to destroy them. He'd come to finish the story they started together. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of asphalt and the faint electric buzz of the city. Ethan's jaw clenched. Mark's voice broke into a nervous whisper. "Is this some kind of threat?" Daniel looked at him steadily. "No, it's an opportunity." The doors of the Hypernova building loomed behind them, the glass reflecting all three men, past, present, and consequence. Daniel turned, gesturing toward the entrance. "Shall we?" For the first time, Ethan didn't answer. He only stared, caught between disbelief and the sudden weight of old ghosts returning to claim what was theirs. And as Daniel led them inside, the Tesla sat quietly at the curb, engine still humming, its dashcam light blinking red. Recording, witnessing, waiting. Outside, the city roared on, oblivious. Inside, history began to fold back on itself. The door closed behind them with a soft hiss. Somewhere deep inside Hypernova's polished heart, the storm began again. The lobby of Hypernova Technologies was all glass and echo. It smelled of ozone, disinfectant, and ambition, the kind of place where even the air seemed calibrated to impress investors. Light spilled through the atrium's towering windows, cutting pale blue angles across the polished marble floor. Every surface gleamed. Every sound, the clack of heels, the hum of servers behind sealed walls, was perfectly measured, rehearsed, curated. Daniel stood at the center of it, invisible to the world he'd once built. The last time he'd been here, his name had been on the building directory. Now, the receptionist didn't even look up. Her attention was glued to a sleek tablet, her voice polite but flat as she greeted Ethan and Mark. They flashed practice smiles, confident, untouchable. "Mr. Blake, Mr. Connors, the board is waiting for you in the summit room," she said, pressing a button that unlocked the private elevator. Her eyes flicked toward Daniel, briefly curious. "And you are?" Daniel's answer was simple, almost soft. "An old friend." He stepped into the elevator behind them. The doors closed with a quiet chime. For a moment, none of them spoke. The hum of the lift filled the silence. A sterile, metallic whisper rising through 47 floors of glass and code and money. Daniel could see their reflections in the mirrored walls. Ethan with his jaw set, Mark pretending to check his phone but gripping it too tight. Daniel himself stood between them, calm as water. He could feel their unease growing like heat. Recognition was a slow poison. It started in the eyes, then spread to the hands, the breath, the voice. They were both trying to hide it, but it was there. The ghost they thought they'd buried had stepped into their elevator. At the 32nd floor, Mark finally spoke. "Daniel, you didn't call ahead." Daniel smiled faintly. I thought it might be more authentic this way. Ethan's reflection stiffened. If you came here to make a scene, this isn't the place. Oh, Daniel said, still looking at their reflections rather than their faces. I'm not here for a scene. I'm here for clarity. The elevator dinged. The doors opened. The summit room waited. A vast expanse of glass walls overlooking the skyline. A long table of black stone stretching like a runway. And at the far end, a dozen people in suits whispering over tablets and coffee cups. The board. The new blood of Hypernova. When Ethan walked in, they straightened instantly. He was still the star, the visionary. Daniel watched him glide back into his kingdom. Charm turned up like a dimmer switch. Mark followed, trying to look composed, though sweat had already started to gather at his temples. Daniel entered last. A few heads turned, puzzled. He looked older, yes, silver at his temples, fine lines at the corners of his eyes. But there was something ageless in his calm, the kind of silence that demanded attention. Ethan gestured vaguely toward him. This is Daniel Tran, a former investor. He's here as a guest. A few murmurs followed. Polite, curious, harmless. They didn't know. Not yet. Daniel took the seat at the far end of the table. The chair was familiar, the same kind he'd sat in when Hypernova was still his dream. He rested the black briefcase beside him and watched the city spread out beneath the glass, cranes and cars and the smog-streaked glow of progress. When Ethan began the meeting, Daniel listened. The words washed over him, projections, forecasts, partnerships, buzzwords dressed as prophecy. The rhythm hadn't changed. Corporate ambition still spoke its native tongue of arrogance disguised as vision. At first, the board barely noticed him. But then Daniel began to ask questions. Not loud ones, not confrontational. Surgical questions. Precise. Each one cutting deeper than the last. You mentioned a new offshore entity. When exactly was it formed? A pause. Papers shuffled. Someone coughed. And the data migration, Daniel continued, his voice even. Was that approved by compliance before or after the signature of the preliminary contract? Ethan tried to keep his smile in place, but Daniel could see the tremor in the corner of his mouth. Mark jumped in, his tone brittle. I'm not sure that's relevant, Daniel. This is a closed financial strategy discussion. Oh, but it is, Daniel said, leaning forward slightly. His eyes met Ethan's. Especially when the strategy involves deceiving a partner company with falsified projections. The room fell silent. Someone's pen slipped and rolled across the table. Outside, a helicopter passed by, its shadow flickering briefly across the glass. Ethan's voice hardened. You don't know what you're talking about. Daniel reached for the briefcase. The latch clicked open, soft and deliberate. Inside were neatly stacked folders, contracts, memos, encrypted drives. He slid one across the table toward Ethan. I do. You see, I've been watching, listening. He glanced toward the corner of the room, where a small red light blinked, the Tesla's camera feed, streaming live. Every word from your little car ride this morning was recorded. Every detail of your plan to defraud your partner, your board, and the SEC. Mark's face turned gray. Ethan didn't move. You bugged us. Ethan whispered. Daniel smiled again, a tired smile this time. You bugged yourselves. You used my car. He leaned back. You forgot, Ethan, Hypernova was built on my architecture. Every system, every protocol, every piece of data routing still carries a trace of me. You erased my name, but not my design. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the city below. The board members exchanged glances. Confusion, suspicion, dawning fear. Ethan looked like a man who had just realized the floor beneath him was glass and beginning to crack. Daniel stood slowly. His voice dropped to a near whisper, but it carried through the room. You wanted control. You wanted to cut out the past to make room for your empire. But you built that empire on deception, and now it's collapsing under its own weight. He turned toward the board. Ladies and gentlemen, I suggest you review the contents of that drive before the SEC does. You'll find your CEO and CFO have been planning a fraudulent transfer of company assets for personal gain. Gasps. Movement. Panic. Mark stammered something, denial, justification, but no one was listening. Ethan's jaw clenched, his eyes burning with something between fury and disbelief. You think you can waltz back in here and destroy everything we built? Daniel's reply was quiet, almost gentle. No, I came to save what's left of it. He picked up the briefcase, snapped it shut, and walked toward the glass wall. The skyline spread below him, bright, merciless, eternal. When you build something on trust, he said softly, betrayal doesn't destroy it. It just reveals what it really was. He turned back once more, meeting Ethan's eyes. And what you built, Ethan, was never hypernova. It was just fire, bright, fast, and doomed to burn itself out. He left them there, the board whispering, the two traitors drowning in their silence. Outside, the sun had begun its slow descent behind the skyline. The glass tower glowed like molten gold. Daniel walked toward his car parked at the curb. He could feel the tremor of adrenaline fading, replaced by something quieter. Not triumph, not even peace, just an ending that had finally come home. He slid into the driver's seat. The Tesla's interior greeted him with a soft chime. The dash display blinked once, then opened the secure feed, the live footage already copied and uploaded to a remote server. He stared at the progress bar, watching it reach 100%. Above it, a single line of text appeared, upload complete. Encrypted copy sent to U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. Daniel closed his eyes. The hum of the car wrapped around him like a heartbeat. He thought of the first time he'd met Ethan, the boy's restless energy, his conviction that he could bend the future to his will. Daniel had admired that once. Now it only felt tragic. The city outside flickered alive as night fell. Streetlights ignited, one by one, like constellations reborn. He drove, slowly, letting the traffic fold around him. For the first time in years, he didn't have a destination. Somewhere on Sunset Boulevard, he pulled over. The street was quiet, lined with jacaranda trees. He parked under their violet bloom, rolled down the window, and let the cool air in. He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small, worn photograph. 3 men on a balcony, holding champagne glasses, laughing into the night. A younger version of himself beside Ethan and Mark. The city lights blurred behind them, all promise, no pain. He stared at it for a long time, then folded it carefully and tucked it back away. The rearview mirror caught his eyes, older now, yes, but steady. There was no hatred there, only distance. He whispered to no one, "Goodbye, Hypernova." The Tesla's engine purred, smooth and low, as he pulled back onto the road. Behind him, the tower still glowed, but its light was already fading into the haze. Ahead, the freeway stretched open, endless, waiting. Daniel pressed his foot to the accelerator. The car merged into the night, a single streak of motion cutting through the city's glittering arteries. And somewhere, far behind him, the past began to crumble. The night uncoiled across Los Angeles like a living thing. The city breathed neon and asphalt, murmured in the language of traffic and distant sirens. Daniel's Tesla glided through it all, silent and steady, its engine barely a whisper against the pulse of the metropolis. He could feel the city under his hands, through the wheel, the rhythm of 1,000 stories passing by him, anonymous and eternal. He didn't know where he was going. Or maybe he did, but refused to name it. Freedom doesn't always have coordinates. Sometimes it's just the absence of pursuit. The highway opened before him like a vein of light, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt untethered from everything that had once defined him. Money, legacy, betrayal, ambition. He had burned the bridge and walked away without looking back. The hum of the tires filled the quiet between thoughts. Outside, the streetlights blurred into streaks of amber. His phone vibrated once on the dashboard. An alert from a news feed he didn't remember subscribing to. He ignored it, but the second buzz was insistent, then a third. He reached out absently and glanced at the screen. Breaking news. Hypernova Technologies under investigation for corporate fraud. CEO and CFO facing SEC probe. He watched the headline scroll by, his own reflection faint in the glass. Beneath it, smaller text blinked. Anonymous source provides detailed recordings and documentation to federal authorities. Anonymous. Daniel smiled, not out of satisfaction but out of recognition. He had finally disappeared into the one place no one could find him, between the lines of his own story. He turned the phone face down. The car took an exit toward the coast, and the air changed, salt and fog and the clean emptiness of the Pacific night. He rolled the window down. The wind cut cold against his face, a baptism of clarity. Somewhere far below, waves collided against black rocks. He thought about Ethan and Mark, their faces at the table. The moment the truth unfolded like a blade in that glass room. He wondered what they were doing now. Sitting in some law office calling their lawyers, pretending this could still be undone. But Daniel knew the truth. There are no undo buttons in the lives of men who trade their souls for profit. Only consequences that arrive late, but certain. He pulled over at a cliffside lookout. The ocean stretched before him, endless and silver beneath the moon. He got out of the car, the wind whipping his shirt, the smell of seaweed and brine thick in the air. Below him, the waves folded and unfolded like breathing. He stood there a long time, watching the dark horizon swallow the lights of the city behind him. Freedom, he realized, was quieter than he expected. He had imagined it once as noise, laughter, champagne, applause, but those things belonged to the world he had escaped. True freedom was this, the ability to stand in silence and not owe anything to anyone. And yet, in that silence, memory crept back like tidewater. He saw Ethan again. Not the man in the tailored suit, but the kid he had met in a small office with peeling paint, eyes bright with impossible dreams. He remembered the night they first stayed up till dawn, sketching on napkins, arguing over architecture diagrams, both of them laughing like children who thought they could outsmart the universe. People will forget the code, Ethan had said, but they'll never forget the vision. Daniel had believed him. Now, years later, he wondered if that boy had ever truly existed, or if he'd just been a shadow wearing sincerity until the money arrived. He wanted to think that somewhere inside the ruins of the man Ethan had become, a fragment of that dreamer still lived, confused, maybe even ashamed. But he knew better. People don't change. They just reveal themselves over time. The wind shifted. He shivered and returned to the car. Inside, the dashboard clock glowed 11:47 p.m. He sat there, motionless, staring at the horizon. The Tesla's lights dimmed automatically, leaving him in a cocoon of half-darkness. A memory stirred, a conversation long ago, one that had seemed meaningless at the time. Mark, laughing after a late-night meeting, had asked him, "You ever think about what happens when we win, Daniel? When we finally get everything we want?" Daniel had replied without thinking, "That's when we start losing." He hadn't understood then how right he was. He turned the keyless ignition, and the Tesla awoke with a low hum. On instinct, he pulled up the voice recorder, scrolling through the files. There they were, their voices frozen in digital memory. The conversation in the car. Every word of deceit. Every laugh. He could delete it now. It was over. But his thumb hovered over the screen. Instead of erasing, he hit play. The guy won't even see it coming. He's desperate. He let it play for a few seconds, the sound muffled under the ocean wind outside, then stopped it. The silence afterward felt heavier than before. He whispered, "You were right, Ethan. I didn't see it coming." His voice cracked on the last word, but he didn't notice. Sometimes victory sounds like loneliness. He reached for the glove box again, pulling out a different object this time. A small notebook, its pages yellowed, edges frayed. On the first page was written in his neat handwriting, "Project Hypernova Vision Draft 2013. He flipped through the sketches, the early notes, the wild ideas that had once seemed impossible and pure. The diagrams of architecture modules, the scribbles of names for algorithms. It wasn't just a company. It had been a dream, a living thing. He closed the notebook gently. For a long time, he just sat there with it on his lap. Then he opened his phone again, not for the news, but for the Uber app. He toggled himself online. New request. Pickup, LAX Terminal 4. Destination, downtown LA. He smiled faintly and accepted. The road called him again, simple, honest. A man and a machine and the night between them. The passenger was a woman in her 40s. Tired eyes, carrying 2 suitcases and a laptop bag. She smiled politely as she got in. Long night? She asked. They're all long, he replied. As they drove, she talked, a habit Daniel had learned to expect from travelers. She told him she was an executive, that she'd just left a company she'd spent 10 years building. She laughed bitterly, saying she didn't even take her nameplate from her office because it felt like stealing from her own ghost. Daniel listened, nodding at the right moments. When she paused, he asked quietly, "Did they betray you?" She looked surprised. "You could say that." He smiled, not unkindly. "Then you're free now." She frowned. "It doesn't feel that way." "It will," he said. They fell silent again. Outside, downtown lights grew closer, pulsing through the windshield like veins of electricity. The woman eventually dozed off. Daniel drove slower, letting the moment stretch. There was something peaceful about carrying someone through their own turning point, even if they didn't realize it yet. When he finally stopped in front of her hotel, she woke with a start. "How much do I owe you?" she asked, reaching for her phone. "Nothing," Daniel said. She blinked. "What do you mean?" He turned slightly, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "Consider it an investment. You'll pay it forward someday." She hesitated, then smiled, tired but genuine. "Thank you." When she left, Daniel watched her disappear through the revolving doors, dragging her life behind her in 2 rolling suitcases. He thought briefly that he might never see her again. But the strange comfort was that he didn't need to. Some stories only intersect once, like stars crossing paths before the sky resets. He drove on. By dawn, the sky had begun to soften from black to blue. The freeway was nearly empty, the city exhaling after its nightly fever. Daniel pulled into a gas station, bought coffee from a vending machine, and leaned against the hood of the Tesla as the first light spread across the horizon. He felt something he hadn't felt in years: lightness. Not joy, not even relief, but something closer to absolution. The world would move on. Hypernova would fall, rebuild, or vanish. Ethan and Mark would face their reckoning. None of it mattered now. He had given back what he'd taken from the world. His silence for their deceit, his patience for their greed. The scales were balanced. He took a sip of the bitter coffee and laughed softly. The taste was awful, but it was real. When he got back into the car, his reflection in the window caught his eye again. He barely recognized the man staring back. The eyes were softer now, the lines deeper, but there was peace in them. He started the engine. The Tesla hummed awake, ready to move. And as the sun rose behind him, he whispered a single word. Not to anyone, not even to himself, but to the road that had carried him through every version of his life. "Drive." The car responded as if it understood. It rolled forward, smooth and soundless, down the empty road that shimmered with new light. Behind him, the past dissolved into distance. Ahead, the city waited not as a battlefield anymore, but as a beginning. For the first time, Daniel didn't need to know what came next. He was already there. Morning in Los Angeles arrived not with peace but with a pulse. The kind of sunrise that doesn't so much illuminate as expose. Every crack in the concrete, every billboard hanging with hollow promise, every dream unfinished and still breathing. Daniel watched the city unfold through the windshield as his Tesla rolled down Figueroa Street, the sun breaking in shards across the glass towers. It had been 3 days since the hypernova reckoning. 3 days since the headlines detonated across every major network, painting the once golden startup as a nest of deception and greed. SEC investigation, board suspension, internal collapse. Words that had the cold efficiency of executioners. Daniel hadn't looked for updates after that first morning. He didn't need to. He could already imagine it. Ethan pacing in his penthouse, phone pressed to his ear, watching everything he'd built crumble under the weight of his own ambition. Mark trying to broker deals, make calls, explain away the unexplainable. And the board, those polished ghosts in their tailored suits, scrambling to distance themselves from the inferno they'd once worshipped. But that world wasn't his anymore. He drove aimlessly, taking rides here and there. Sometimes he picked up tourists with cameras, sometimes silent commuters staring at their phones, sometimes men who smelled like whiskey and loss. Each of them entered his car carrying invisible weight, and each of them left a little lighter, unaware that the man driving them was someone who'd carried entire empires once, only to bury them in the dust. The Tesla's hum became his lullaby. But peace is a fragile thing, and the past, when wounded, doesn't die quietly. Came back to him on the fourth night. He'd parked outside a diner off the Pacific Coast Highway, the kind of place where time had stopped sometime in the 80s, neon sign flickering, jukebox muttering old Sinatra. He sat in a corner booth with a cup of black coffee cooling beside him. The TV above the counter was tuned to a late-night talk show, the host laughing too loudly at something he didn't mean. Then the program cut to news, just a short bulletin. But the name that came out of the anchor's mouth hit him like a whisper in a graveyard. Breaking update in the Hypernova Technologies investigation. Sources confirm former CEO Ethan Blake has been found dead in his residence in Bel Air. Initial reports suggest an overdose, though authorities have not ruled out foul play. The words blurred for a moment, then steadied. Daniel didn't move, didn't breathe. The coffee went cold, untouched. The world around him carried on, the clatter of dishes, the hum of conversation. But for Daniel, sound folded in on itself. All that remained was the static hum of the television and the memory of Ethan's voice. It's not personal, Daniel. It's just business. He thought of the way Ethan had smiled that day, all polished charm and cruelty, unaware that one day he would stand at the same edge Daniel once did. Stripped of everything, staring into the hollow space success leaves behind. But Daniel hadn't wanted this. Revenge had never been his aim, only truth. Yet the line between justice and ruin had always been thinner than anyone dared admit. He'd torn the mask off Ethan's empire, but he hadn't planned for what came after. He hadn't thought about the silence that would follow when the world finally stopped listening to their lies. The waitress, a woman with kind eyes and weary shoulders, noticed the stillness in him. She approached quietly. "You okay, sir?" Daniel blinked, forcing himself back into the present. "Yeah," he said softly. "Just a long week." She smiled faintly, as if that explained everything. "Aren't they all?" When she left, Daniel stood, left some bills on the table, and walked out into the night. Outside, the air was colder. The ocean roared somewhere beyond the parking lot, invisible in the dark. He leaned against the car and stared at the horizon that wasn't there, trying to make sense of the ache beneath his ribs. He had thought victory would feel clean, surgical, final, but instead it tasted like ash. For a long time he just stood there, watching the wind play with the edges of his coat. Then he got in the Tesla, turned the keyless ignition, and let the soft hum fill the silence again. He didn't drive. He just sat, the dashboard glow reflecting faintly in his eyes. He remembered Ethan at 25. Full of impossible energy, spinning dreams into air, talking so fast Daniel could barely keep up. He remembered the way he'd called him mentor, the way he'd once said, "You're the closest thing I have to a father in this business." He had believed that once. Now the words felt like a cruel echo. The next morning, Daniel drove without direction, ending up in places he hadn't seen in years. The old Hypernova warehouse, empty now, dust gathering where innovation once burned. The pier at Santa Monica, where he and Ethan had once signed their first big deal on a paper napkin. Each stop was a ghost, and Daniel moved among them like a man visiting his own grave. At noon, his phone rang. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Mr. Tran." A woman's voice, calm, professional. "This is Agent Collins with the SEC. We'd like to thank you for your cooperation in the Hypernova case. I know you wish to remain anonymous, but I thought you should know. Without your evidence, it might have taken years. Daniel said nothing. The agent continued. I also wanted to inform you that Mark Connors has turned himself in. He's offering full cooperation in exchange for leniency. He finally spoke. And Ethan? A pause. Then, quietly, I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Tran. He almost laughed. Loss? He repeated. You make it sound like he was still mine to lose. She hesitated, unsure how to respond. You did the right thing, she said eventually. Sometimes that's all any of us can do. When she hung up, Daniel sat for a long while with the phone still in his hand, staring at the black screen as if it might give him an answer. The right thing. Maybe. But right things still leave wreckage. He started driving again, this time toward the hills. The sky was wide and mercilessly blue. The city glittered below like a mirage, beautiful from a distance, rotten up close. He parked at an overlook and got out, the wind tugging at his hair, the sun hot on his skin. Below him, Los Angeles sprawled, endless, indifferent, hungry. He thought of the years he'd spent building Hypernova, the years after losing it, the years spent in silence behind the wheel. The company had been in orbit once, a gravitational pull that kept him alive even as it crushed him. But now that it was gone, what was left? He closed his eyes. For the first time, he let the exhaustion catch up with him. The years of holding everything together, the constant balancing act between grace and vengeance. He felt every moment of it, every scar invisible to the world. Then slowly he breathed. The sound of the wind filled his lungs. The salt of the ocean carried faintly on the air. And somewhere inside him, something let go. Maybe this was what redemption felt like. Not glory, not forgiveness, just release. That evening, he returned to the city. The streets were alive again. Horns, laughter, music from open bar doors. The kind of chaos that reminded him that life always continued, no matter whose story ended. He drove through it, anonymous, content to remain unseen. When he stopped at a red light, a boy on a bicycle pulled up beside him. Couldn't have been older than 15. He leaned toward the window and grinned. Cool car, mister. Daniel smiled back. Thanks. The boy tilted his head. You rich or something? Daniel chuckled. Not anymore. The light turned green, and the boy rode off, weaving through traffic, free and reckless. Daniel watched him go until the figure disappeared into the glow of the next street. For a second, he envied that kind of fearlessness, the kind only youth and ignorance can afford. Then he drove on. The night grew older, the city quieter. At some point, he found himself back where it all began, in front of the Hypernova building. The glass tower still stood, but darker now. The logo at the top no longer lit. Security lights flickered weakly along the edges, casting long, thin shadows across the sidewalk. Daniel parked at the curb and stepped out. The air smelled faintly of rain. He looked up at the building, this monolith of ambition that had once been his cathedral. For a long time he said nothing. Then softly he whispered, "Rest now." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't mourning. It was simply acknowledgement, a farewell between creator and creation. He touched the hood of the Tesla once, then turned and walked away. Later, as he drove along the 101 toward the outskirts of the city, the sky began to open again, clouds parting to reveal stars faint and scattered. He hadn't seen stars in years. The city had always been too bright for them. But out here, where the noise faded, they returned, timid and real. He rolled down the window and let the wind in. There would be no epilogue for Hypernova, no grand redemption arc, no dramatic closure. Just the quiet continuation of a man who had finally learned to live outside of the story. Somewhere down the road, he might stop driving. Maybe he'd find a small house near the ocean, maybe he'd start teaching again, or maybe he'd just keep driving until the road ended. For now, it didn't matter. The horizon was enough. The Tesla's lights carved through the dark, and Daniel followed them, steady, unhurried. The world rolled by, shadows, cities, faces, all blending into motion. And as the freeway stretched out before him, endless and unbroken, he whispered the same word he had before, a promise to the night, to the road, to himself. "Drive." The car responded, soft and sure, carrying him forward into the uncharted distance. The city disappeared behind him. The stars brightened above. And Daniel Tran, once the architect of empires, once the ghost of vengeance, became what he was always meant to be. A man in motion, free at last. The road to Monterey wound like a slow confession, a ribbon of gray unraveling through hills and mist. Morning light spilled over the Pacific in fragments, scattered by fog, so that the sea seemed less a body of water than a living breath, rising, falling, whispering secrets only the wind could understand. Daniel drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly on the window, the cool air slipping through his fingers. He had been driving for 3 days. No destination, no plan, no clock dictating where he should be. He ate when he remembered, slept in roadside motels when the stars blurred into exhaustion, and spoke only when necessary. Small words exchanged with gas station clerks or waitresses who smiled out of politeness, not recognition. He didn't tell anyone his name. Somewhere between Los Angeles and the northern coast, the city had disappeared entirely from his mind. He didn't think of Hypernova or the men whose choices had collapsed it. He didn't even think of Ethan anymore, not as the boy he'd once mentored, nor the man who'd betrayed him, nor the ghost who had left the world too soon. Those thoughts had dissolved the way salt does into water, absorbed by something larger, indistinguishable. What remained was silence. And in that silence, for the first time in years, he felt something fragile stirring inside him. Not joy, that was too loud a word. Not peace either, not yet. It was smaller than that. Something like forgiveness, perhaps, though not directed at anyone else. It was for himself. He stopped the car at a lookout above Big Sur. The morning fog was still heavy, the cliffs below veiled in white. He sat on the hood of the Tesla, coffee cup steaming beside him, watching the world shift slowly from shadow to light. The ocean below was patient, eternal. Each wave crashed and receded, repeating the same truth he had spent a lifetime trying to learn. Everything returns, everything leaves, and none of it truly belongs to us. He remembered words from an old book he had read in college, when he still believed life followed reason. Man cannot step into the same river twice, for it is not the same river, and he is not the same man. Now, sitting on that cliff's edge, he understood. He was not the man who had founded Hypernova, nor the man who had lost it, nor even the one who had brought it to its reckoning. He was simply someone who had survived all three. The wind tugged at his coat, carrying the scent of salt and pine. Somewhere far off, gulls screamed above the surf, a sharp sound against the steady rhythm of waves. He thought of all the people he'd met in the back seat of his car, strangers who had cried without meaning to, who had confessed to him because his silence felt like safety. In a way, he had become the world's witness, the quiet observer of its private aches. Perhaps that had been the real reason he'd started driving. Not to escape, but to understand. And now, as he looked out at the horizon, he realized there was no longer anything to understand. The answers didn't matter anymore. The asking had been enough. He finished his coffee and stood, brushing the salt dust from his hands. The sun had broken through the fog now, spreading gold across the water. It painted the edges of the Tesla, the road, his skin, as though the world was gently rewriting him. He drove north again, the engine whispering beneath him. The road narrowed, curved, widened, a metaphor he didn't need to name. Miles unspooled behind him like a film ending without credits. He stopped again in a small coastal town just beyond Carmel, where cottages leaned against the wind and the ocean was always within reach. The sign at the edge of town said "Welcome to Point Clarity," a name so coincidental it almost made him laugh. There was a bed and breakfast at the corner, painted pale blue, its porch wrapped in ivy. He parked in front, took his small bag from the trunk, and checked in. The woman at the counter had gray hair tied in a bun and eyes that had seen too many stories to be surprised by any. She didn't ask his last name. He didn't offer it. "Room 3, she said, handing him a brass key instead of a card. "Faces the ocean." The room was simple. White sheets, wooden floors, a small balcony with a view of the sea. He left the window open and sat by it, listening to the waves roll in. Afternoon sunlight filtered through lace curtains, scattering across the room like pieces of time. He slept for hours, dreamless, deep, unbroken. When he woke, the light had changed again, dimming into the blue of dusk. The air smelled of sea salt and rain. Somewhere below, someone was playing an old piano, slow, hesitant notes that drifted upward like the tide. He stood and stepped out onto the balcony. The ocean stretched before him, endless and alive. He watched the horizon blur into the sky until he couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. That was when he took the photograph from his pocket, the one he'd carried all this way. The three of them, younger, brighter, believing in a world that no longer existed. He looked at it for a long time, tracing the faces with his thumb. Then, without ceremony, he tore it in half, first through his own image, then through the others, and let the pieces fall. The wind caught them, carried them out over the cliff, then down into the sea. For a moment, he thought he saw the fragments glint like silver fish before they vanished into the deep. He whispered, "Goodbye, Ethan. Goodbye, Mark." The sound was swallowed by the wind, but that was enough. He stayed on the balcony until night came fully, the stars spreading across the sky like forgotten memories returning home. He hadn't seen stars this clear in decades, each one a small, perfect wound of light. He thought of his father then, a fisherman who had crossed the Pacific with nothing but a compass and a stubborn belief that destiny was something you built, not something you waited for. Daniel hadn't thought about him in years, but now his memory rose gently, like the tide. He remembered his father's hands, rough, patient, teaching him how to tie knots. "You see, son," he had said, "a good knot doesn't fight the rope. It understands it." Maybe that was the secret, Daniel thought. Maybe all his life he'd been fighting the rope, trying to force meaning where there was only motion. He laughed quietly, a sound that surprised him. The kind of laugh that comes not from joy, but from the relief of finally understanding sorrow. The stars flickered above him. The ocean moved below. The wind sang its wordless song through the open window. And Daniel, sitting there in the soft glow of the night, realized something simple and profound. He was no longer waiting for anything. The next morning, he woke before sunrise. The world was pale and quiet. He dressed, packed his small bag, and checked out. The woman at the counter smiled at him as if she already knew he wouldn't be back. Outside, mist hugged the coastline. The Tesla waited, glistening with dew. He ran his hand along the hood, feeling the cool metal beneath his palm. It had been his companion through everything. His confessional, his witness, his cathedral. He started the engine. The dashboard screen glowed softly, waiting for input. For a moment, he considered entering a destination. San Francisco, maybe Seattle, but his fingers hovered, then dropped away. He didn't need a map anymore. He pulled onto the coastal road. The fog was thinning now, the sky opening in slow gradients of pink and gold. The radio, unprompted, began to play an old song. Something from the 70s, all soft guitar and melancholy. He drove with the window down, the air sharp and clean. The road curved along the cliffs, the sea glittering beside him. And with every mile he felt lighter. Not because he was escaping anything, but because he finally knew he didn't have to. Somewhere ahead, the sun broke fully over the horizon. Light spilled into the car, filling it, blinding and beautiful. Daniel blinked against it, smiling without realizing he was smiling. He whispered again, to no one but the wind, "Drive." The car obeyed, merging into the light. Behind him, the ocean kept its rhythm, endless, unjudging. The fragments of his past drifted somewhere beneath those waves, dissolving into salt and memory. Ahead, the road stretched forever. And as he disappeared into the horizon, Daniel Tran, builder, betrayer, witness, survivor, became what he had always been meant to be. A traveler, moving toward the quiet place where the road meets the sea, and the sea meets the sky, and the story finally exhales. The world continued, vast and forgiving. And for the first time, Daniel was simply part of it.